The casserole dish shattered on my kitchen floor at 7 in the morning, ceramic splinters skittering across the tile like shrapnel. I stood in the doorway, still in my pajamas, watching my brother-in-law scrape the remains of the lasagna I had made the night before into the trash. Not a word of apology, not even a glance in my direction. He just tossed the broken pieces into the bin, opened my refrigerator like he owned it, and pulled out the last of my good orange juice. "We're out of the kind with pulp," he announced to no one in particular, chugging it directly from the carton. My sister walked in behind him, already dressed, already wearing her judgment like a second skin. She looked at the mess on the floor, looked at me, and sighed the long, theatrical sigh of a woman who had perfected the art of making everything someone else's fault. "Leah, you really shouldn't leave dishes on the edge of the counter like that. It's a hazard." 3 weeks. They had been in my house for 3 weeks, and somehow I had already become the problem. My name is Leah, and I am 31 years old. I work as a certified fraud examiner for one of the largest insurance investigation firms in the Southeast. My job is to find the lie underneath the story, to trace the money that disappears, to build the case that puts the right person in the right courtroom. I have caught people who faked their own deaths. I have unraveled shell companies built by people far smarter than my sister and her husband. But I could not, for the longest time, find a way to protect my own mother from the people sleeping in my guest room. My father passed away 8 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, 12 weeks from diagnosis to the end. He was a high school history teacher and a woodworker, a man who could quote Reconstruction-era legislation and also hand-carve a cabinet with equal patience. He left behind my mother, 23 years of marriage, a small but fully paid-off family home in Marietta, Georgia, a life insurance policy, and a grief so heavy my mother had not been able to stand fully upright since the funeral. My sister arrived with 2 SUV loads of luggage 6 weeks after the burial, smiling and crying at the same time the way she always did when she wanted something. The story was that their house in Alpharetta had a pipe burst, catastrophic water damage. The contractor needed 3 months minimum. She needed somewhere for her and my brother-in-law to stay, just temporarily, just until the work was done. I said yes. I said yes because I believed her, and because my mother was alone in that grief-soaked house in Marietta, and I was stretched thin trying to check on her twice a week while managing a full caseload at work. I thought having my sister nearby might help. I thought wrong. They moved into my house in Decatur, but within 4 days they had essentially relocated their lives to my mother's house as well, arriving there every morning before I left for work, staying through dinner, making decisions about the furniture and the food and the thermostat as though the house were a hotel they had simply checked into a little late. My brother-in-law took over the garage. My father's woodworking tools, the hand planes and the chisels and the Japanese pull saw he had saved up for 2 years to buy, were pushed into a corner to make room for a home gym setup that my brother-in-law had rented and never paid for, as I would later discover. He treated my mother with the affable condescension of a man who had never once been told he was wrong. He called her Mom, even though she had never invited it. He made suggestions about her finances the way people make suggestions about restaurant orders, casually and without being asked. My sister, for her part, installed herself as the household manager. She reorganized my mother's kitchen. She threw away canned goods she deemed unhealthy. She rearranged the living room furniture, moving my father's armchair, the one he had sat in every evening for 2 decades, out of the corner where it had always lived and into the hallway because the space flows better this way. My mother did not argue. My mother was too tired to argue. That was the whole point. I noticed things. That is what I do. I notice the small anomalies that most people file away as coincidence or oversight. The way my brother-in-law lowered his voice whenever he took a phone call in the backyard. The way my sister steered conversations about my father's estate away from me whenever I tried to ask about the timeline for probate. The way my mother had begun prefacing sentences with "your sister thinks" and "your brother-in-law suggested" instead of forming her own opinions. I noticed, but I did not yet act. I kept telling myself I was being uncharitable. I kept reminding myself that grief does strange things to families, that proximity creates friction, that my sister had her flaws, but surely she was not doing what the back of my mind was beginning to suggest she might be doing. The night I stopped making excuses was a Tuesday. I came home from work late, close to 9 o'clock. I had stopped by my mother's house first, let myself in with my key, found the house quiet and smelling of the lavender candles my sister had replaced my mother's rose-scented ones with. My mother was in bed by 8:30 now, another recent change. My father used to stay up until midnight, and my mother had always kept his hours. Now she was in bed before the news. I was standing in the hallway about to call out goodnight when I heard my sister's voice from the kitchen, low and careful. I did not mean to eavesdrop. I stopped because something in her tone made my feet stop moving. "She signed it, didn't she?" my brother-in-law said. "She signed it," my sister replied. "She didn't read it. She just asked if it was for the house account, and I said yes, and she signed." A silence. The sound of a cabinet opening, ice going into a glass. "And the attorney?" he said. "My attorney, not hers. He's not going to ask questions." I stood in the hallway for a long time after they moved to the living room and the television came on. Then I let myself out without making a sound, sat in my car in the dark driveway, and called my firm's legal database access on my phone. I typed in my brother-in-law's name. I had a long drive home and a longer night ahead of me. The document my sister had my mother sign was a durable power of attorney. It gave my sister full authority to make financial, medical, and legal decisions on my mother's behalf, effective immediately, not contingent on any finding of incapacity. My mother had signed away her own autonomy under the impression she was signing a household account authorization form. I found this out over the next 11 days, working from the desk in my spare bedroom after everyone in my house was asleep. I am not a lawyer, but I know how to read documents and I know who to call. I have a friend from law school, a woman named Danielle who does estate litigation and who, once I explained what I had seen and heard, spent 40 minutes on the phone with me on a Sunday night without once suggesting I might be overreacting. While Danielle started pulling the thread on the legal side, I started pulling the financial one. I requested copies of my mother's recent bank statements under the pretense of helping her organize her taxes, something I did every year, something that required no explanation. What I found required several deep breaths and a second cup of coffee. In the 6 weeks since my sister had arrived in town, 4 transfers had been made from my mother's checking account to an account I did not recognize. They ranged from $800 to $1,400. Each one had a memo that read household expenses. The total was just under $5,000. Taken individually, they looked routine. Taken together, they were a pattern, and a pattern is all I need. I ran the receiving account number through every search I had access to, which was considerable. The account was attached to an LLC registered in my brother-in-law's name 6 months prior. The company was called Renovate Partners LLC. There was no renovation. I already knew that. There never had been a pipe burst, a water damage claim, a contractor. I checked the insurance claim index for their Alpharetta address and found nothing filed in the past 2 years. They had not been displaced. They had planned this. They had manufactured a reason to insert themselves into my mother's life at the exact moment she was most vulnerable, and they had brought the paperwork with them. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The next discovery was not financial. It was personal, and it was the one that broke something loose in my chest that I had been holding carefully shut. I drove to my mother's house on a Saturday morning to help her with the yard, something we had done together since my father got sick, raking leaves, pulling weeds, maintaining the small order of the property he had always kept immaculate. It was the one ritual that still felt like him. My mother always talked more in the yard than anywhere else. I think the open air made it easier to say the things that were too heavy for indoor spaces. I knocked and my brother-in-law answered, which already told me something was wrong because he had no reason to be there before noon on a Saturday. He told me my mother was resting. He did not step aside. I looked past him into the house and stopped. My father's workshop corner in the garage, the corner where his tools had been for 23 years, was empty, not reorganized. Empty. The pegboard where his hand tools had hung was bare. The cabinet where he kept his chisels was gone. The workbench itself was pushed against the far wall and piled with boxes. "Where are his tools?" I said. My brother-in-law shrugged. "We needed the space. There's a guy your sister knows who does estate sales. She had him come pick things up last week. She sold my father's tools. They were just sitting there. Your mom said it was fine." My mother had not said it was fine. My mother had been told it was clutter. My mother had been worn down by weeks of small persuasions until she no longer trusted her own instincts about what was hers to keep. I knew this because I knew her, and the woman who would give away my father's Japanese pull saw, the one he had special ordered and spent weeks learning to use and taught me to use on a summer afternoon when I was 14, that woman did not exist. I drove home and I did not call my sister. I did not go back inside. I sat in my car and I allowed myself exactly 10 minutes of the kind of grief that makes you want to say things you cannot take back. And then I opened my laptop and I went to work. Because here is the thing about being a fraud examiner. You learn very quickly that the emotional reaction and the professional response cannot happen at the same time. Anger is a fire that burns evidence. What I needed was not a confrontation. What I needed was a case. Danielle and I had already agreed that the power of attorney had serious problems. My mother had not had independent legal counsel. There was a clear fiduciary conflict. If we could demonstrate that my mother had been misled about what she was signing, the document could be challenged. But challenging a legal document takes time, and time was the one thing I was afraid I did not have. The escalation happened the same week. I had set up a tablet in my car, using it as a secondary screen when I worked late at my mother's house. One evening I arrived and let myself in, and the house was quiet in the wrong way. The way that means people are present but not moving. I set the tablet on the kitchen table and went to look for my mother. I found her in the living room. My sister was sitting next to her on the couch, close, in the way of someone who has made a point of being physically proximate and emotionally overwhelming. My mother had a document in her lap. My brother-in-law was sitting across from her with a pen held out like an offering. I stood in the doorway. "What is this?" I said. My sister looked up. She did not flinch. That was the moment I understood completely how long she had been planning this. A person who was caught doing something they knew was wrong would have flinched. "It's an updated beneficiary designation," she said, "for Dad's life insurance. We found out that the current form is outdated. It might create complications during distribution. It's just administrative." My mother looked at me. There was something in her eyes that I recognized, a kind of uncertain apology. The expression of a woman who has been told so many times that her instincts are wrong that she has stopped trusting them altogether. "I can take a look at that," I said, stepping forward. My brother-in-law pulled the document back from my mother before I reached her. "It doesn't concern you," he said. "It's between your mom and your sister. You're not a beneficiary on that account." I looked at my mother. "You don't have to sign anything right now," I said, quietly, clearly. "There is no deadline for paperwork like this. If anyone tells you there is a deadline, they are not telling you the truth." The silence was very long. "I think I need some time to think," my mother said finally. My sister stood up. I had never seen her look at me with such naked dislike. She had always disguised it before, wrapped it in the language of concern and advice and older sister authority. Now there was nothing between me and what she actually felt. "You're always doing this," she said. "You always have to be the expert in the room. Dad put you on a pedestal your whole life and you have never once gotten over yourself." I did not respond to that. I looked at my mother and I said, "I'll call you tomorrow morning," and I left. In my car, I activated the recording I had been running on my tablet in the kitchen. It had caught everything. What followed next was the 2 worst days of my professional life outside of an actual courtroom. I worked every night until 3 in the morning. I requested financial records. I compiled timelines. I cross-referenced transaction dates against my sister's presence in my mother's house, against my brother-in-law's LLC activity, against the power of attorney signing date. Danielle reviewed my mother's original will and flagged 3 irregularities that suggested my sister had access to documents she should not have had access to. Then I found the piece that made everything else look like a warm-up. The life insurance policy. The one my sister had tried to get my mother to refile the beneficiary designation on. I tracked down the original policy documents through the insurance company, which I could do because my mother had named me as the contact person for correspondence 2 years earlier, before any of this started. The current beneficiary was a split. 50% to me, 50% to my sister. Standard. What my sister had prepared for my mother to sign would have redirected the entire policy to a trust. The trust's administrator was my brother-in-law's LLC. My father's life insurance policy was worth $400,000. I sat with that number for a long time. I called Danielle at midnight and she answered on the second ring because she had been waiting. "We need to move," I said. "I know," she said. "I filed the emergency petition 2 hours ago." What she had filed was a petition to have the power of attorney reviewed and suspended pending a competency evaluation, not of my mother, but of the circumstances under which she had signed. The judge scheduled a hearing for Friday. That gave me 4 days. My sister did not know about the petition. My brother-in-law did not know about the recording. They were still sleeping in my guest room, still eating my food, still planning what I assumed would be their next move. I let them. Investigators let the subject talk until they hang themselves. I had learned that from the first case I ever worked, a staged auto accident involving 3 families and a complicit body shop owner, and I had never forgotten it. The thing I had not planned for was Thursday. My mother had a tradition she had maintained every year since I was a child. On the first Thursday of December, she hosted a small dinner for the neighbors and a few close family friends. My father had always grilled, regardless of the temperature. After he died, my mother had said she wasn't going to do it anymore, and then October came and she called me to say she had already sent the invitations because it was what my father would have wanted. 12 people, the neighbors from across the street who had watched me grow up, my mother's closest friend from church, my father's former colleague from the high school, a man named Walter who had been his closest friend for 19 years. My sister had inserted herself as the organizer. She had rearranged the seating. She had replaced the centerpiece my mother had chosen, the pine branches and the white candles my father had always liked, with something she called more modern. She had told my mother she would handle the toasts. I arrived early. I brought a gift for my mother and a flash drive in my pocket. The dinner went the way these things go when everything underneath is wrong but the surface is performing normalcy. My brother-in-law poured wine and made conversation about real estate. My sister complimented the food she had not cooked. My mother sat at the head of her own table looking like a guest in her own home. After the main course, my sister stood up and asked for everyone's attention. She had prepared remarks. She talked about family and about loss and about the importance of coming together. She said she and my husband had been so grateful to be close during this difficult time. She said that she and my mother had been talking about the future, about making sure everything was organized and provided for, about plans for the house. She said it with the warmth of someone announcing something celebratory, and the people at the table nodded along because the words sounded like love and no one had any reason yet to hear them as something else. I stood up. My sister stopped mid-sentence. "I actually have something I'd like to share," I said, in the spirit of honesty, which I think is what Dad would have wanted. I walked to the small television in the living room that was visible from the dining room table. I plugged in the flash drive. My sister said my name in a tone that was designed to sound like gentle concern and was actually a warning. I pressed play. The recording from the tablet was clear. The kitchen acoustics had been kind. Everyone at the table heard my brother-in-law's voice first, the casual confidence of a man who believes the room is already his. They heard him ask if she had signed. They heard my sister confirm it. They heard the exchange about the attorney. They heard it all the way through to the end. The table was quiet in a way that felt pressurized, like the moment before a storm. Walter, my father's friend, pushed his chair back and looked at my sister. He had known her since she was 9 years old. "What did you have her sign?" he said. His voice was very quiet. My sister looked at my mother. She was calculating. I could see it, running through her options. She opened her mouth to speak. I changed the slide. The documents appeared on the screen: the power of attorney, the beneficiary redesignation form, the transfer records from my mother's account to Renovate Partners LLC. I had organized them cleanly, the way I organize evidence for a deposition, chronological and annotated, with the relevant figures highlighted. $5,000 was not a fortune, but intent is not measured in dollar amounts. My mother was looking at the screen. She was not crying. She was reading. I had printed copies of everything and I slid one down the table to her, and she picked it up and she read it the way she used to read my school papers, carefully and without rushing. My brother-in-law stood up. He said several things in quick succession. The standard sequence. "This is being taken out of context. Leah has always had an agenda. This is a family matter, and it doesn't concern the people at this table." He was working his way toward the front door. "Sit down," Walter said. The authority in his voice was the kind that comes from decades of standing in front of classrooms and demanding attention. My brother-in-law sat down. My sister turned to me with the last weapon she had left, which was sentiment. "You're doing this at Mom's dinner," she said, and her voice had a tremor that might have been real. "After everything she's been through. You're doing this tonight." I looked at my sister. I looked at the woman who had sold my father's tools without asking, who had walked into my mother's house in her worst month and begun dismantling everything he had built, not because she needed to, but because she wanted what was in the safe without going through the trouble of earning it. "Yes," I said, "I'm doing this tonight, because tomorrow morning there's a hearing in front of a judge, and I wanted Mom to understand what she agreed to before she had to hear it in a courtroom." My mother set down her copy of the documents. She looked at my sister for a long time, the kind of look that contains an entire history, the kind that a mother gives a child when she is finally done pretending not to see something. "Is this true?" she said. My sister said nothing. My mother folded the papers carefully and set them in front of her plate. She looked at Walter. She looked at the neighbors. She sat very straight in the chair that had always been hers, at the head of the table in the house she and my father had bought together 31 years ago. "I'd like you to leave," she said to my sister and her husband. Her voice did not waver. "Both of you. Tonight." My brother-in-law tried one more time. He talked about the inconvenience, about where they were supposed to go, about how my mother was being manipulated by a daughter who had always been jealous. My mother stood up. I had not seen her stand up like that, with that particular quality of stillness, since my father's eulogy. She had stood at the podium and spoken for 12 minutes without notes, and everyone in that church had understood by the end that she was not a woman who could be diminished by circumstance. "My husband built this table," she said. "He built this table with his hands, and we have eaten at it together for 30 years. You will not sit at it and tell me who has manipulated me. Get out of my house." The room was very quiet. They left. It took 45 minutes and it was not graceful, but they left. Walter stayed to help my mother with the dishes. The neighbors stayed until she told them she was all right. When the house was finally empty except for the two of us, my mother and I sat at the kitchen table, and she poured us both tea, and she asked me to explain everything from the beginning. I told her all of it, every transfer, every document, every piece of the picture. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she wrapped both her hands around her mug. "Your father always said you were the one who would protect this family," she said. I didn't know he meant from inside it. The hearing on Friday lasted 20 minutes. The judge suspended the power of attorney, pending a full review. Danielle filed an additional motion based on the financial transfers, and by the following Tuesday, my brother-in-law's LLC was the subject of a formal fraud inquiry. The estate sale man my sister had hired, the one who had taken my father's tools, was located within the week. He still had the Japanese pull saw. He had not sold it yet. I drove to his warehouse and I paid him what he had paid my sister, and I brought it home and I put it back on the pegboard in my mother's garage. And I did not try to explain to my mother why I was crying when I did it. My sister called me 3 times in the 2 weeks that followed. I did not answer. I was not ready. And I was not certain I would ever be ready in the way she was hoping. The way that ended with things going back to a version of normal that had only ever been normal for her. I got a different kind of call instead. It came on a Tuesday evening, while I was at my mother's house helping her sort through some of my father's papers. A professional investigator I had worked a case with 2 years earlier, a woman who ran her own firm in Atlanta, asked if I had time to talk. She had heard, through channels that I did not ask her to specify, that I had recently handled a complex financial manipulation situation involving a power of attorney and a fraudulent LLC. She had a client in a similar situation, elderly, isolated, family member with access. She needed someone with my specific combination of skills. She asked if I was interested. I was sitting in my father's chair when she called. The one my sister had moved into the hallway. My mother had moved it back. I said I would think about it. I said that because I had learned, in the past weeks, not to say yes to things before I had looked at them from every angle. To take the time to understand what I was agreeing to before I put my name on it. I called her back the next morning and said yes. My mother made breakfast that day, the first time she had cooked a full meal since before my father died. Eggs and toast and the strong coffee he had always kept in the house, The kind she used to say was too bitter but had continued buying because it was his. She set it on the table, and we ate together, and outside the window the yard was cold and brown and waiting for spring, and everything that had been dismantled was slowly beginning to come back to where it belonged. I am not someone who believes that justice is clean. It is not a door that closes with a satisfying click. It is a slow adjustment, a recalibration, a long and sometimes unglamorous process of rebuilding what should not have been broken in the first place. But I believe in it. I have spent my career believing in it, and sitting at that table, watching my mother drink her coffee in her own kitchen, in the house that was still hers, I understood that the work I do does not stay in conference rooms and courtrooms. Sometimes it is the most personal thing in the world. If you have ever had to fight for someone you love against the people they trusted most, then you already know what I am talking about. If you are in the middle of it right now, I want you to know something. Grief is not a weakness. It does not mean you owe anyone access to your home, your accounts, or your future. And the person who tells you that asking questions is an act of disloyalty is the person you should be asking questions about. My father kept a wooden sign above his workbench that he had made himself, burned letters in a piece of scrap oak. It said, "Measure twice, cut once." I think about that a lot. If any part of this story stayed with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to Pie Revenge. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to protect someone you love from the people who claim to love them too?